This is a Sunday that is a high-energy Sunday, I think. Every place you go around town, you can feel the energy, the excitement, and some of the anxiety, because we all know that for most of our kids, school starts tomorrow. And it's always a big moment. It's a big moment in the lives of families, of children, and really it's a big moment in the life of the church and of the community. So I thought that this morning we would preach on children. So I'll invite you to turn to your New Testaments, to the second chapter of Luke. In this Bible, it's page 59 of the New Testament. That might be where it is for you. And we're going to read about a story that I think only Luke tells this story about Jesus in the temple, beginning with verse 42 of the second chapter. When Jesus was 12 years old, his family went up as usual for the festival. This is a religious festival in Jerusalem. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. Then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. Now count this up. 1 day out, 1 day back in. As a friend of mine pointed out, that's 2 days right there that he's been missing. After 3 days, when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. But when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, now listen to the words and the tone, because we've all done this. This has happened to all of us who are parents. Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety. And he said to them, and listen to his tone, why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This is, by any measure, a terrifying story. Now, you can read the Bible in a lot of ways, and if you just zip through this story, you might not recognize how terrifying it is. But if you read it with any kind of sensitivity at all, especially from the perspective of a parent or a grandparent, you know that this is a terrifying story. For most of us, it has happened on more than one occasion. I see my wife Bobby up in the balcony. I remember a number of years ago, she's going to know exactly where I'm going on this. We were at the State Fair of Texas. We had our 2 children, our younger son Josh, our older son Adam, and we had our instructions. Stick together, hold hands, don't get separated no matter how crowded it becomes. But if you do get separated, there's Big Tex. Always go to Big Tex. We'll meet you at Big Tex. Now let me tell you, if you're here today and you live here in Plano or Dallas, you've been around for a while, and you don't know who Big Tex is, you're not a true Texan yet. But we had the plan. So sure enough, middle of the day we looked up, Adam's not there. I mean, has disappeared, vanished into thin air. And so we're a little bit panicky. We start looking for him, but we don't worry too much. We go to Big Tex. Everybody can find their way to Big Tex, right? We get to Big Tex, and Adam is not there. We are panicked. We wander around. Finally, we find him in the shadows of the Cotton Bowl. I think he was sliding down the greens there on a cardboard, which they enjoy doing more than riding the rides. And you know what it's like. When you find your child under those circumstances, you go up and you don't know whether to hug them and embrace them and kiss them and get down on your knees and say, thank you, God, or whether you want to do what Mary did and say, why have you done this to us? Don't you know? You want to discipline them. And so we know that for these parents, this was a terrifying event. A day out, we know how innocent it was. They've been to Jerusalem. They had a great time. They're traveling in a group. They're walking on the road from Jerusalem to Nazareth. Everybody's having a good time. Mary and Joseph aren't worried about this at all. They can hear the kids back behind them playing, like Mason and Braden over here. The cousins are back there. They're laughing, playing. It's not an issue. Until they stop that night, build the campfire to camp out. And all of a sudden, Jesus is nowhere to be found. So a day back to Jerusalem, looking all around Jerusalem for 3 days. How difficult it must have been. Let me tell you what's even more terrifying. If that had happened today, you know what would have happened, wouldn't you? Don't you? Parents about as innocent as they could be in this case. They weren't negligent parents. But if that had happened today, there would be at least a little interview with the police and maybe some kind of incarceration or arrest. And Jesus would have been turned over to CPS. That's what would have happened today. And so these are the kind of things that these little rabbit trails that I go on when I read the Bible. I start thinking about these kinds of things. What if that had happened? What if there had been an intervention on the part of the authorities and they'd taken Jesus and they'd turned him over to CPS? How would the story have turned out? I've thought about that some. I don't know about you, but as I think about it, I think the story would have really still turned out to be a good story. Because, of course, it's God's story. What if Jesus, when he was a teenager, what if Mary had been diagnosed with breast cancer when Jesus was a teenager? How would that have changed the story? How would have the story turned out? I think about this. I think the story would have still turned out okay, a good story, because it's God's story. And God is always in charge of the ending. And so we think about this, don't we? All of those things that happen in your life and mine, the uncle who gets jailed for drugs, the unexpected diagnosis, the detours that we take in life that are painful and unintended and unexpected. I think the story still comes out okay as long as we remember it's not really our story. It's God's story. It's what God does with us. So let's return to the story. Mary and Joseph are there in the temple. And they have this unusual, and you've experienced before, these mixed emotions. On the one hand, they're anxious and angry with Jesus, and you hear it in the tone of Mary's voice. And on the other hand, they're so relieved that they have finally found him. But it is the reply of Jesus that is really the center of the story. He looks up at them with all innocence and says, "Where else would you expect to find me other than in my Father's house?" He knew and he understood that he belonged to God. Belonged to God. Let me tell you this. On the eve of the opening of school tomorrow, so do your children and mine. Our children belong to God. And at some extraordinary level, they already know that. I like to say that children are born with a kind of inbred, a kind of a genetic homing device for God. Just like Jesus sitting there in the sanctuary, he knew he was at home. He knew he was with the one who loved him. And so try this if you will. Try sitting down before you put your children to bed and say, "Let's learn the Lord's Prayer," and see how much enthusiasm you'll get. They'll love doing that. If you don't already do this, try saying grace before every meal and see how much young children embrace that. There is something about children that is naturally spiritual. And they understand that when they are in the presence of God, they are in the presence of the one who loves them. Every once in a while, a discovery will be made that makes a huge impact in our lives. Sometimes it comes from the fields of science or social science. I predict that one of these days, a great cosmologist, maybe a theoretical physicist or somebody, will make a scientific discovery from the hard sciences that points to the presence, the existence of an intelligent creator. I believe that that will happen. And when it does, it will change the landscape in which we all live as Christians. A couple of years ago, a book was written that I think changes the landscape for us as Christian parents and grandparents. It is amazing to me that this hasn't caught fire in every church, in every cathedral, in every synagogue, in every mosque in America. I wrote about it at the time. It's a book by the name of The Spiritual Child. Put the slide up here, if you will, Ben. The Spiritual Child by Lisa Miller. The New Science of Parenting for Health and Lifelong Thriving. Let me say to you that since the publication of this book, Lisa Miller has become a kind of a star. Most people in this city still do not know about her, but she has speaking engagements all around America. And she's enough of a star that it costs a lot of money to get her. But we're bringing her here to Christ United Methodist Church. The date is September the 29th, 6:30 to 8:30. There'll be a 45-minute presentation by her, followed by a panel of experts talking about the spirituality of children. I hope you're pulling out. It's fine with me. Ordinarily, I don't want to see your iPhones, but if you want to pull out an iPhone and put this date in your calendar, that's fine with me, because I hope every one of you will be there, whether you have children or grandchildren or not. This program has been generously underwritten by a donor who cares about children. And I think the cost at the door is $5. If you don't have, we're going to try to recover some of that cost. If you don't have $5, come anyway. Child care will be free, because this will be an eye-opening experience for you. Let's go to the next slide. I want to share with you some of her research. This is research-based. She's a clinical and research psychologist, research-based. Our first finding: we are inherently, genetically spiritual. This is our natural spirituality. Her research shows that we as human beings are born. It's in our DNA. We do, in fact, have a spiritual homing device within our DNA as human beings. Secondly, genetic expression of spirituality surges in adolescence. It is there in an extremely powerful form in your 3-year-old, your 4-year-old, your 5-year-old, your 6-year-old. It moves into a second and powerful stage when our children become adolescents. Some of you have experienced this yourself or seen it in your children. It's why the ministry, youth ministry in the life of the church is so important. It surges in adolescence along with other innate faculties, puberty, cognitive development, etc. Personal spirituality, read this phrase. Personal spirituality is the most potent form of protection against suffering in adolescence. Let me just add to this. My own conversations, ongoing conversations through the years with people who are in recovery, every one of them will tell you that their practice of spirituality is the most potent protection they have against the demons that would destroy them. And so it is with our adolescents, and it is absolutely natural. Thirdly, our natural spirituality is closely allied with human bonding, creating relational spirituality, or the experience of transcendence through relationships with one another, with a higher power, and within ourselves. Let me translate that a bit. What social psychologists call social capital, the ability to relate to other human beings in positive ways. And then, if you read this more carefully, the ability relationally to be in transcendent relationships, things like marriage, friendships, powerful, lasting friendships. Spirituality is a part of that. This research is so compelling. It's so important to you and to me and to the life of our community. I want to read you a bit more. This is from, is a review that I think came out of the New York Times. In The Spiritual Child, psychologist Lisa Miller presents the next big idea in psychology: the science and the power of spirituality. She explains the clear scientific link between spirituality and health, and shows that children who have a positive, active relationship to spirituality tune in on these statistics, are 40% less likely to use and abuse illegal substances, are 60% less likely to be depressed as teenagers, are 80% less likely to have dangerous or unprotected sex, have significantly more positive markers for thriving, including an increased sense of meaning and purpose and high levels of academic success. If those statistics are even halfway right, it is a compelling indictment of where we have gone in the life of our culture and the importance of the work that we do in the life of the church, in the life of the synagogue, in the life of the cathedral, in the life of the mosque. Nurturing the spirituality of our children is the most important job we have in the world. This is another one of those kind of intellectual rabbit trails I travel down occasionally. I was driving around this morning, as I always do, and I was thinking about these remarkable statistics. And I started thinking about growing up in the 50s and 60s. Now look, everything wasn't perfect about the 50s and 60s. I get that. I understand that. But in the 50s and 60s, this is the question that kind of haunted me. In the 50s and 60s, we had the highest attendance, Sunday school attendance in America, in the history of America, at least in the modern history of America. The highest Sunday school attendance in the 50s and in the early part of the 60s of any time in the 20th century and the 21st century. And it was across the board, all ethnicities, all demographics, all locations. It was in rural areas, it was in urban areas, in suburban areas. Back in the 50s, children who lived in California even went to Sunday school. And so this is the question that kind of haunts me. Do you suppose there's any correlation between the fact that in the 50s and 60s, more children went to Sunday school than in any other time in recent history, and that drug usage by teenagers was practically non-existent compared to today? I don't know. Correlation is not the same thing as cause and effect. I understand that. What I do know, and have always known, and that is now substantiated by research, is that our children are naturally drawn to God. Just like Jesus. They know when they're in the church, they are in their Father's house. There's nothing more important than the children that we nurture for the next generation. I have a grandson. My younger grandson, Ben, is going to be starting school sometime this year. I call him B-Ben. When he was learning his ABCs, when he got to B, he made that connection. He said, B-Ben, I'm B-Ben. And so I call him B-Ben. And when I started working on this sermon, I started thinking about what it is I'd like for Ben to learn in kindergarten this year. And all of a sudden, I remember this book. It came out in 1987. I was stunned that it's that long. Almost 30 years ago, 1987, a book that was a huge bestseller by Robert Fulghum called All I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. And I thought, I might say a word about that in my sermon. I thought, no, everybody knows that book. And then I realized, no, if you're not old, you don't know that book. It's 30 years old. But if you're old, you remember reading that book. We all read it. So I went back and I pulled out some of the highlights of all I needed to know I learned in kindergarten. I'm going to share some of them with you. All I really need to know I learned in kindergarten. All I really need to know about how to live and what to do and how to be, I learned in kindergarten. Wisdom was not at the top of the graduate school mountain, but there in the sand pile at Sunday school. These are the things I learned. Share everything. Play fair. Don't hit people. Sometimes when I'm talking to my grandsons, I summarize all this by saying, just do the right thing. You know what the right thing is. Put things back where you found them. He has a little section that's related to nations. He says, what if nations did all these things? Clean up your own mess. Don't take things that aren't yours. Say you're sorry when you hurt somebody. Wash your hands before you eat. Flush. That's one we're still working on with Ben. Warm cookies and cold milk are good for you. Live a balanced life, learn some and think some, and draw and paint and sing and dance and play some every single day. Take a nap every afternoon. It's a bit of a challenge for some of us. When you go out into the world, watch out for traffic. Hold hands. Stick together. Be aware of wonder. Remember the little seed in the styrofoam cup? The roots go down, the plant goes up, and nobody really knows how or why. But we are all like that. Goldfish and hamsters and white mice and even the little seed in the styrofoam cup, they all die. So do we. And then remember the Dick and Jane books and the first word you learned. The biggest word of all, look. Look around and see God everywhere. Everything you need to know is in there somewhere. The golden rule and love and everything else. That's what I want Ben to learn in kindergarten this year. Maybe you and I could revisit those lessons. There's a great story about Jesus that all three of the synoptic gospel writers tell. Matthew, Luke, and Mark all tell this story. It's 20 years after Mary and Joseph found Jesus there asking questions in the temple. Jesus is a grown man now. He's in the middle of his teaching and preaching career. And he's out there and a big crowd has gathered. And he's teaching and preaching and people love this. And then all of a sudden parents start bringing children to him. They just want him to bless their children. They bring up to him because these parents know that their children have inbred genetic homing devices for God. They somehow know they're in the presence of God. So they're bringing these children. And the disciples, who could at times be so ridiculous. I slipped at the last service. I used a word I probably shouldn't use, describing the disciples. They could just be so ridiculous. That's the best word I can find right now. They started playing the role of security guards. So get the kids out of here. Get the kids out of here. And Jesus, in one of those moments when we see Jesus really right at the edge of anger, there aren't many of those, but you'll see them. And Jesus says, wait just a minute. Bring me this child. And he holds this child and he blesses him. And he says, to such as these belong the kingdom of God. And then he turns to the disciples and he says this, if you do not become like a child, you will never experience the joy of the kingdom of God. In other words, everything you and I need to know, we learned in kindergarten.